In this chapter, we will look at a more robust form of analysis, pivot tables. Pivot tables can be used to summarize large datasets and quickly generate lots of different insights. We can aggregate our data, analyzing insights in every way imaginable by slicing and dicing our data. We will use a dataset to illustrate what the basic aspects of pivot tables are and how we can use each area in our analysis. We'll cover the best practices to filtering our data with pivot tables, creating an intuitive user experience with slicers and timelines. And then we'll see how we can build on top of pivot tables to visualize our data with pivot charts. Pivot tables are also a common way that we can interact with Power Pivot in Excel. Power Pivot is a data modeling tool inside of Excel. We won't spend too much time on this subject, as Beta has entire courses dedicated to this topic. But we will cover a few examples to see how Power Pivot can be used to create pivot tables on multiple source tables, and how Power Pivot is often paired with Power Query to create a modern, robust, and powerful analysis in Excel. We will wrap up the chapter by looking at ideas, or analyze data, in Excel. This is an artificial intelligence feature that lets us ask questions of the data inside of our Excel workbook and then interact with the results. Let's head back into Excel to analyze our data with pivot tables. Here is a small dataset contained within an Excel table. We will start with a dataset of this size to see how pivot tables work, and then we will move on to one that is much larger. Since our data is already formatted as an Excel table, we can click anywhere in the table to bring up the Table Design tab on the ribbon. From there, we have the option to summarize our Excel table with a pivot table. In this pane, we see that we've defined the table that will be the data source for our pivot table, and then we have the option to choose where we want the pivot table to be placed. Rather than a new worksheet, let's add to our existing worksheet, and then I'll put this here in cell F1. And select OK. So let's start summarizing the dataset by populating our pivot table here. So in the Pivot Tables Fields pane, over to the right-hand side of the screen, we see the list of columns or fields from our dataset. We can drag these fields into one of the four areas below. We have filters, columns, rows, and values. Let's start by adding the sales field to the values area. Once I do this, we can see that we get one single value in our pivot table, the total sum of sales. If I add a total row to the Excel table, we can see that we get the same value. So let's click back onto our Excel table and add a total row. And we see that these two values are the same. Let's go back to our pivot table. Pivot tables allow us to quickly add additional context to the values in the columns and the rows area. Let's add city into the rows of the pivot table. Now we have 3 rows, one for each of the cities in our Excel table here. Notice how the data is grouped and aggregated within our pivot table. Each city appears a few times in the source table, but it only appears once in the pivot table, with the total sum of sales for each city in the pivot table. This is what we mean by summarizing our data. We can add further detail to the pivot table by adding the store field to our columns. And we can also refine the summary of our data by using the filters area here. If I add the date field to this area, we have the option to select a single date that we want to display the data for. So from the drop-down, I can select just one single date. And we see the information within our pivot table updates and changes. And if I select a different date, we get information just for that date. And from the drop-down, we can also select multiple values as well. I can toggle on select multiple values, and now we can pick all the dates or just a few, and hit OK. A main strength of pivot tables is how quickly we can pull together this initial analysis, but also how quickly we can iterate and look at different views of our data. Next, let's update our pivot table and see how we can sort the data inside it. Let's start to update our pivot table. Back into the pivot table, I'm going to remove the filter from the date field. I'll select all the values, and let's actually remove it from our fields area. And I can do that just by clicking on it and dragging it away. Let's move the store field from the columns area, and we'll drag that underneath the city field within the rows area here. And now we have a more detailed breakdown of how each store contributes to the total sales within a city. Now I can add the date field back to our pivot table, this time in the columns area. With this view, not only do we have a more detailed view within each city, but we can start to look at the trend in sales over time for each store. Another common way that we may want to analyze this store sales data is to sort the order of our stores in order of sales. That way we can quickly identify our top performers. To sort data in a pivot table, we can navigate to the row header here under row labels, and then from the drop-down, we can define how we want to sort our data. So we can sort the city from A to Z, which we do here, or from Z to A, and now Vancouver appears at the top, and then Tokyo and Seoul. From the drop-down, rather than the city field, we can also select how we want to sort the store field in our rows. We can sort from largest to smallest, or smallest to largest. Let's sort from largest to smallest. And now we've changed the order that the stores are sorted as well. Rather than sorting by the row label, as in the city name like Vancouver, or the store numbers like 1, 2, and 3, we can sort these in order of sales, or whatever field is in the values pane. So from the drop-down, let's sort the city field, rather than sort A to Z or Z to A. Under more sort options, we can sort descending, but rather than sorting the city field by city, we can sort it by sum of sales, and select OK. And now when we look at the grand total for each city, we see that they're sorted in descending order. And we can do the same thing for the stores within each city as well. If we look at the Vancouver stores, Store 2 has the highest amount of sales, so we may want Store 2 to appear at the top. So from the drop-down again, on the store field this time from the drop-down, more sort options, sort descending by sum of sales, and hit OK. Now our cities are displayed in descending order by our sum of sales fields, as well as the individual stores within each city. So we've seen how we can update and sort data in a pivot table. Now let's move on to see some of the additional analysis options available to us. Once we have clicked anywhere in our pivot table, we can see the Pivot Table Analyze tab up here on the ribbon. Let's go through the different sections on the ribbon to see what different analysis options we have available for our pivot table. The very first option here is the ability to name our pivot table, and this is particularly helpful when we have multiple pivot tables in our workbook. We'll see this in action in a little bit. The next section is the Active Field section. When we click on the different areas of the pivot table, the rows or the columns or the values, we can see the active field that we have selected in the pivot table, and we can interact with this field from the ribbon here. So when I'm clicked into the cities field within the rows of our pivot table, we can see that city is highlighted as the active field. And I can interact with this active field by using some of these buttons. So for example, I can collapse the view so that we don't see the store detail, we only see the subtotal of city. We can also do this within the pivot table itself by using the expand and collapse buttons here. If I select a different field, like the sum of sales from our values, I can select the Field Settings button under the active field. And this brings up some additional options and settings for this field. We have options of the type of aggregation that we want to summarize the field by. For example, rather than sum, we could have a count or an average. We can set a custom name for this field, rather than the default name, which is the aggregation type, followed by the field name, as we see here with sum of sales. and we can also update the number format. If we don't need to know the detail of our sales rounded to the nearest cent, but rather rounded to the nearest dollar, we could change that format here by changing it to a number, adding a 1,000 separator, and rounding to 0 decimal places. If I hit OK and OK, we see that the values have updated in our pivot table. In the next section of the Pivot Table Analyze tab, we have the option to group our fields. If I click back on the city, maybe I want to group together Seoul and Tokyo to create a division for our cities. So let's select Seoul and Tokyo, and if I press Group Selection, now we have a new layer in the rows of our pivot table. And I can undo this grouping by clicking on the group and then pressing the Ungroup button. This is useful for grouping field values in ways that don't appear in our source data. The next section on the ribbon is Filter, and we'll come back to filtering data with slicers and timelines shortly. Under the Data section, we have the option to change the data source of our pivot table. If we wanted to, we could point our pivot table to a different Excel table. And next to this option, we have the Refresh button. And this is a crucial concept in understanding exactly how a pivot table works. If we add a new row of data to our Excel table, let's add a store number of 20 and copy the date down, add a sales value, and let's add a new city of New York. Once I've added this new row to the Excel table, notice that it does not immediately appear in the pivot table. We need to refresh the pivot table in order to see this value. So let's refresh, and now we see this new value in our pivot table. When we create a new pivot table, we automatically create a pivot cache, and it is essentially a replication of the data source of our pivot table. And it is this pivot cache that populates the areas of the pivot table. Until we refresh the pivot table, the pivot cache will not reflect the updated information from the source data. Back to the ribbon. We will explore pivot charts shortly, but another option we have is recommended pivot tables. If I click this button, we have a few options that have been generated for us. If we're not sure where to start our analysis, we can take a look at these recommendations and insert one into our workbook. So if I select Sum of Sales by City and select OK, this updates the existing pivot table that we have currently selected. So let's undo that. The final feature that we'll look at is this Show section at the end. We can toggle on and off the appearance of a few different elements of our pivot table. The field list, we see that the authoring pane disappears, and this is where we build the pivot table. The plus and minus buttons, which we can use to expand and collapse nested fields. If I turn that off, they no longer appear in our rows. And finally, the Field Headers button. This will remove the row and the column headers, as well as the drop-down menu from the pivot table. Now that we've explored the analysis options for a pivot table, let's take a look at a few design options. The next tab on the ribbon, available when we have selected a pivot table, is the Design tab. The options in this tab control the appearance of our pivot tables. The first button controls the subtotals. We have a few different options. We can turn off subtotals entirely. We can have subtotals appear at the bottom of the group. And as we've seen so far, we can have the subtotals at the top of the group. Similarly, we have a Grand Totals button, and we can control if we want to display grand totals for our rows, columns, both, or neither. By default, the Report layout, which is the next button, is formatted as compact. Multiple values in our rows area are contained in the same spreadsheet column, with an indent to differentiate the different levels. We can change the report layout to outline, which puts each different level in its own column. As we see here, city is in column F, and now store is in column G. We can also change this to tabular form, and this makes it look more like a classic spreadsheet view of our data. This also forces subtotals to appear at the bottom of the group. We also have the option to repeat all item labels. If I click on this button, the city is now repeated on all of the rows in the pivot table that contain information for that city, as opposed to just the group header. This is similar to how our data is stored in the Excel table to the left. Let's change our pivot table back to a compact form. Under the blank rows button, we can add extra blank items to the pivot table, which can help improve the readability of certain reports. We can remove these blank rows with the other option here. The next section on the ribbon is the pivot table styles option. This contains similar options as we saw to formatting Excel tables. We can bold and accentuate the row and the column headers. By default, this is turned on. And we can also add banded rows to our pivot table or banded columns to our pivot table. And finally, we can change the color and the aesthetic appearance of our pivot table with the pivot table styles section. There are lots of different combinations of these design options, so it's important to always consider which will help us the most with both our analysis, but more importantly, the communication of key insights. Now that we've covered the basics of pivot tables using a smaller dataset, let's move on to working with a larger dataset. Pivot tables are great for summarizing large datasets, like this one. It's another Excel table in a similar form to our previous example, just with a few more columns and a lot more rows. Let's build the same pivot table that we had before. I'll create a new pivot table on our existing worksheet. And let's add sales to our values, store and city to our rows, and date to our columns. And let's add one of our new fields to the filters area, category. Now we can select a single category or multiple categories to create a subset of data that's displayed in the pivot table. So I can select just category 1 or just category 2. One issue with using the filter area is when we have a field with lots of values, like category. We have 10 different categories, and if we want to change the value in the filter or select multiple items in our filter, there's a lot of clicking that we need to do. And when we select multiple values and select OK, it isn't obvious to those reading the pivot table which values have been selected. They need to go into the filter to actually see. Another way to filter a pivot table is by using the drop-down from the row or column header. However, we recommend not using this method. Let's take a look at why this isn't a best practice. From the row drop-down, I can select store, and then I can filter the store number to be greater than 6, and select OK. And when I scroll down the pivot table, it's not obvious that a filter has been applied. We're missing stores 1 through 6 in Vancouver, but unless we know that those stores exist, it's not obvious. The only hint we have is this little filter icon from the drop-down of the row labels. Let's remove this filter. A better way to filter our pivot table data is with slicers and timelines. Slicers provide an interface outside of the pivot table containing buttons that you can click to filter the data. In addition to quick filtering, slicers also indicate which values are selected, which make it easy to understand what the current filter state is. To add a slicer to our pivot table, we can click on the pivot table, navigate to Pivot Table Analyze tab on the ribbon, and select Insert Slicer. Let's add a slicer for the category field and select OK. We can see that we already have some selection in our category slicer because it syncs with the category from the filters area. So let's remove this filter, hit OK, and let's remove category from the filters area. Let's drag our slicer up to the top here. I can resize it to fit above our pivot table. And if I go to the Slicer tab on the ribbon, we can change the number of columns to 5. And let's make this a little bit bigger and move this over to the right here. Now I can select a single value of 1 and the data updates in our pivot table. And I can Control-click to select multiple values, and now it's obvious to see that we've selected categories 1, 2, 4, and 5, and the corresponding data appears in our pivot table. To clear this filter, I can select the Clear Filter button. Let's move on to timelines. Timelines are a special type of slicer that can only take a date field as input. As opposed to buttons, we can drag a slider across the time period of our data and drill up or down to different granularity of date data, from years all the way down to days. Let's click on our pivot table again, and from Pivot Table Analyze, insert Timeline. And only the date column is available to us. I'll press OK. And let's drag this underneath our slicer. I'm going to scroll up to years, and we see that we have the years 2020, 2021, and 2022 in our pivot table, and that's reflected in our timeline. So let's drag this to select only the last year. And we see that this updates the shape of our pivot table. From this drop-down in our timeline, we can go down to quarters, and we can select only Q1, and we can drill down again to months, and only select January. I can expand these columns in our pivot table and remove these subtotals by right-clicking and removing the subtotals. And we can see that we have just January from Q1 of 2022 in our pivot table that we've controlled with our timeline. With slicers and timelines, we can filter pivot table data and easily see which values are included and excluded from our current view. We can enhance our pivot tables, building on top of them to create visualizations of the summary of the data that we've created. We can iterate on these visuals, moving our fields around to the different areas, just like we do with pivot tables. To start, let's create a new view in our pivot table. Let's clear the filter from our timeline, and we can remove all of the dates information from our columns. Let's move city from rows to our columns, and remove store from our rows, and add category. So now we have category on our rows, cities on our columns, and sum of sales as our value. To add a pivot chart, I can go to Pivot Table Analyze, and Pivot Chart. The default visual that comes up is a clustered column chart, and let's go with that, and hit OK. We can move the chart just below our date timeline, and let's resize it to be a bit bigger. Once I click into our pivot chart, we see that some of the names of the areas have updated. We're now in the Pivot Charts fields, and we see that rather than columns and rows, we have legend or series, which is our city, and axis or categories, which is our category field. We can change the appearance of this pivot chart. If I double-click on the legend, we have the option to format the legend, and we can move it to the top of the chart. We can also change the chart type. If we're clicked on the chart, we can go to the Design tab on the ribbon, and then navigate to Change Chart Type. And rather than clustered column, we can change it to stacked column, and hit OK. As we saw earlier, by building pivot tables, we can create lots of different views for our pivot charts quite quickly until we find the perfect type of visualization. So let's update the fields for our pivot chart. Let's close the Format Chart area to go back to our Pivot Charts Fields pane. And let's remove Category from the axis and add Date to the axis. We can drill down from years to quarters by using these Expand and Collapse buttons directly on the pivot chart. We'll go down to quarters here, and we may want to change the chart type again. So I can go back to Design, change Chart Type, and rather than column, we can make this into a line chart, and select OK. We can drill down another level to months, and we can maybe update our timeline to only return the last 2 years of data. We can do some further formatting of our pivot chart directly from the chart itself by using this plus icon, and we can add some chart elements quickly. We can add a chart title, so I can name our chart Sum of Sales Over Time by City. And then similar to how we saw with pivot tables earlier, if I go to the Pivot Chart Analyze tab on the ribbon, we can show and hide some of the elements of our pivot chart. If we don't want to show any of this additional information, we can hide all, and now we have a nice clean visual of our data without any expand or collapse buttons, or I can add them back one by one. We can have Report Filter button, Legend buttons, Axis, and Expand, Collapse, or Show Value. I'm going to leave it there for now, but that's how we can enhance the look of our pivot tables with a visualization of the data with pivot charts. Let's take a look at Analyze Data or Ideas in Excel. This is an artificial intelligence feature that lets us ask questions of the data inside of our Excel workbook and interact with the results. Analyze Data also provides suggestions of analysis that we might want to examine based on a profile of our data. This is similar to the recommended pivot table feature that we saw earlier. To use this feature, let's click on our source table, and from the Home tab on the ribbon, over to the right-hand side, we see the Analyze Data button. Once we click that button and wait a moment for the pane to load, we now have the options to explore our data. We can see at the top here some suggested questions. We may want to look at the percentage of total of margin for each city, or the total margin by city as a column chart. So these are already available as buttons, or if we go to type in a question, we have a lot more questions suggested from the drop-down. How many different cities are there? Top 2 cities by total sales. We can also just ask a question of our data if we know something that we want to look for. I could type in, which store has the most sales? And if I hit enter, we can start to explore our data just with this natural language query. Using everyday language, I can ask a question of our data and we get the answer back. The top store by sales is store 10. If I like this answer to the question, or this is something that I want to add to the workbook, I can click Insert Pivot Table. And this generates a new sheet in our workbook that has the pivot table, and it's called Suggestion 1. If I go back into the Analyze Data pane, we also have the option to filter some of these insights by hitting the gear icon here, and we can determine which fields interest us the most. If I don't care about margin or category, but just store, date, sales, and city, we can filter down the fields that the algorithm runs over to generate insights. But I'll go back from there. We have different types of results of insights that come from our data, like rank, what is the top something, trend, do we see a trend in our data, outliers, which we see here, and then majority. Tokyo accounts for the majority of margin. We see that we have both pivot charts and pivot tables available to us to add to our report. If we're given a new data set and we're not quite sure where to start our analysis, using Analyze Data, where insights are created for us automatically, is a great place to start. And we can filter down from there by selecting which fields we care about or asking our own questions of the data after looking through the suggestions. In this chapter, we analyze larger data sets with pivot tables. Working through a few examples, we saw some of the different aspects of pivot tables in Excel. We saw how to set up a pivot table and the different areas where we can place our data. We saw how to filter our data with the filters area, as well as with slicers and timelines. And then we saw how we can visualize our data with pivot charts. We also looked to see how we can use pivot tables to interact with a Power Pivot data model. And finally, we saw how to generate a pivot chart or a quick analysis using ideas or analyze data in Excel. We've seen how we can visualize our data with pivot charts, but let's move on to the next chapter, where we will look at visualizing our data with Excel charts. Pivot tables are a common way that we can interact with Power Pivot in Excel. Power Pivot is a data modeling tool built into Excel. Let's take a look through this workbook to see the different elements of Power Pivot, how we can use Power Pivot to build a dashboard in Excel, and how we can pair Power Pivot with Power Query to create a modern, robust, and powerful analysis in Excel. This is the finished product of a Power Pivot data model. We can use a model to build a dashboard within Excel. We see that we have a pivot chart and multiple pivot tables, slicers, and a timeline slicer that we can use to interact with our data. When I change the slicer or interact with the filters, the chart and multiple pivot tables change and are updated. Let's have a look at our Power Pivot data model to see what powers this dashboard solution. I'm going to go to Data tab on the ribbon, and we see this Manage Data Model button. This might also be available from a Power Pivot tab on the ribbon, and we can click Manage. Now we can see what's known as the data view within our Power Pivot model. We can connect to data from a variety of sources, even sources outside of our Excel workbook. So far, we've seen pivot tables connect to Excel tables from within the same workbook, but we can pull in data from anywhere and interact with it from a pivot table. We can connect to data from a database, data service, or other sources, including a Power BI dataset. Down here at the bottom, we see that we've added some formulas as we've defined in the formula bar up here, and we've used formulas to create some measures. So far, we've seen pivot tables create implicit measures with our data. When we've dragged a field to the values area of our pivot table, it automatically sums or counts or averages that field for us. But with Power Pivot, we can use a language called DAX, or Data Analysis Expressions, to build measures. Rather than pivot tables creating implicit measures, we can define explicit measures with DAX. Outside of the data view, we also have the diagram view. And here we can see that our data model contains multiple tables of information. And instead of looking up data and creating one single table that has all of the data, we can link information from different tables together to create a data model. And often we create these multiple tables in Power Query, where we can connect to data, transform it, do our ETL process, and then load it into the Power Pivot data model, where we can link multiple tables together and create DAX measures. If we close out of this view and head back into our dashboard, we can see what this looks like from our pivot table fields list. If I collapse down these tables, we see that we have multiple tables of data that we have columns and fields from that we can drag into our pivot tables. We don't need just to use one table of data. If you want to learn more about Power Pivot, how we can build data models with relationships between tables, with explicit DAX measures, to build dashboards in Excel, be sure to check out Beda's Power Pivot Fundamentals course.